Hey everybody, I hope you're kicking ass and taking names. Um, today I'm reading a section from Anselm Jappe's Debord. The section that I'm reading now is titled "The Aporias of the Subject and the Prospects for Action." It's from part 3 of the book. The book doesn't quite have chapters. It has 3 parts, and each part has sections. I'm just reading these sections, on their own as independent pieces. I'm almost done the book, so I am going to have everything from the book on the channel. But they're all the sections are going to be separated, and it looks like there might be like 10 to 15 sections. So here we go. Actually, one moment. Set a timer for myself. Okay. The Aporias of the Subject and the Prospects for Action. Here, as in other places, Debord transcends the conception of a subject ontologically antagonistic to capitalism, while at the same time, in a sense, cleaving to it. The implicit abandonment of that conception and the analysis of the image form is just outlined coexist in Debord with a discourse concerned with, quote, communication, end quote, that is much in common with another favorite theme of the New Left, that of manipulation. On the basis of this concept, the advent of the commodity-based society, like that of oppressive societies of the past, is conceived of as an external aggression from an unspecified source against an already constituted subject that is, quote, different, end quote, from the social order imposed by the, quote, ruling classes, end quote. Such systems, which are contrary to the interests of the great majority, have inexplicably maintained their hegemony for millennia by means of a subtle, quote, manipulation, end quote, supplementing a violence that is never of itself sufficient. The importance attributed by the situation is to the betrayal by representatives of those whom they represent, and their subsequent well-nigh obsessional preoccupation with issues of organization are clear signs of a fundamental delusion that affects the whole of the left. The notion that the masses, proletarians, individuals, or subjects are manipulated, seduced, corrupted, fooled, that they can neither express themselves nor act autonomously. If only they were left to their own devices, capitalist society would supposedly vanish in an instant like a bad dream. No explanation is offered, however, as to where such a ready-made subjectivity might have taken shape. We really have no good reason to believe that it ever existed in the past, save perhaps in some kind of fragmentary form, only to be demolished by the corrosive action of the commodity. The postulation of such an a priori status for the subject is a mainstay of the modernist left, yet it absolves capitalism without even realizing it of its most grievous fault, namely that it prevents the formation of that very self-conscious subjectivity, many of whose necessary preconditions it has itself created. A mistaken response to this problem is that offered by structuralism, for which the subject is not yet to be realized for the simple reason that the subject cannot exist. The present society is thus implicitly accorded the status of an external human condition. Ever since the action of the historical proletariat reached its climax and the class was successfully integrated into capitalist society, thus transforming a semi-feudal society into a truly capitalist society, the left has been placing various pretenders upon the vacant throne of, quote, the good cause, end quote, third world peoples, women, students, immigrants, the, quote, excluded, end quote, data entry keyboarders, even such disembodied phenomena as sexuality, creativity, everyday life, and so on. Footnote. Identifying the, quote, revolutionary subject, end quote, with a proletariat redefined in an excessively broad way was nevertheless generally much more realistic than identifying it with a circumscribed sociological population segment, as Marcuse did apropos of students. End footnote. The militant spirit with which some of these categories at times defend their interests tends to obscure the fact that none of them, at any rate in their current form, is external to the value form and the money system. The situation is even believed that they had discovered the vastest and most irreducible subject possible, quote, life, end quote. Unfortunately, this approach does not solve the problem of the subject, as is demonstrated by the rigid dichotomous vision to which it leads. The relationship of society to the spectacle comes to be pictured as one between life and non-life, to the commodity, the economy, and the spectacle defined as a, quote, negation of life that has become visible. A negation of life that has become visible, end quote, as, quote, non-life, end quote, as, quote, the life moving of itself of that which is dead, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, sections 10, 123, and 215. Is opposed life as flux. Any attempt to interrupt the flow of time is construed as reification. It would certainly be a mistake to tax the situationists with, quote, vitalism, end quote, in any traditional sense, in the sense that Bergson or Simmel was a vitalist. Footnote. It would be equally mistaken to call Lukács a vitalist. Lukács specifically rejected, quote, irrationalist philosophies from Hamann to Bergson, end quote, history and class consciousness, end footnote. They in no way meant to criticize social institutions or art as extraneous to life as it actually exists today. When some critics described them precisely as, quote, vitalists, end quote, they protested that they had formulated a, quote, most radical critique of the poverty of all the life that is permitted, end quote. Undoubtedly, they wished to contrast life and life's reifications, but they wished to do so in the name of another life. Yet, just as Bergsonism left a deep mark on French existentialism, no matter how much existentialism might deny it, it likewise exercised a not insignificant influence on Debord, chiefly in respect of the definition of temporal flux as a truly human dimension. Footnote. To have been influenced by Bergson, Debord would by no means have had to study Bergson in any detail. The whole of French cultural life was long impregnated with Bergsonism. End footnote. One wonders, too, how far Debord's theories are open to a criticism often leveled at Lukács' history and class consciousness, which many have accused of transforming the concrete and the historical problematic of fetishism into a set of generic and anthropological concerns. It is true that in Lukács' account, reification arises from a failure of facts to dissolve into processes, and ultimately, indeed, from the very existence of facts, the very existence of a material world. And if the material world cannot be abolished, we are obliged to infer that disalienation for Lukács must take place, as it did for Hegel in the sphere of consciousness. And it is on this plane that the, quote, total man, end quote, is to be infused with life. Adorno also takes history and class consciousness to task for focusing its criticism on a form of consciousness, namely reification, when what need criticizing are the actual conditions under which men live, and not the way in which those conditions present themselves to the mind. Footnote. Theodore Adorno, Negative Dialectics, 1966. End footnote. Attempts have been made to insert Lukács' book into a late 19th century tradition of, quote, vitalism, end quote, in the broadest sense. The basic thesis of this current of thinking is said to be the necessity of things dissolving into a continuous movement, singular moments of which are erroneously fixed by the intellect. Alienation is identified in this context as the division between subject and object, and described in terms of the existence of a world irreducible to the subject. The remedy proposed is the reduction at the level of thought of things to movement. Is something of this to be found in Debord? Debord writes that it is of the essence of the spectacle that, quote, the spectacle arrogates to the spectacle self everything that in human existence exists in a fluid state, so as to possess it in a congealed form, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, so implying that fluidity corresponds to the human dimension. Similarly, in Lukács, we encounter the conviction that the very emergence of something qua, quote, thing, end quote, is already a reification. Quote, the recognition that social facts are not objects, but relations between men leads eventually to the point where facts are wholly dissolved into processes, end quote. History and class consciousness. Debord tells us that in the spectacle, quote, concrete things are automatically masters of social life, end quote, Society of the Spectacle, and that things have everything that living people lack. Quote, it is things that rule, that are young, things themselves that vie with each other and usurp one another's places, end quote, Society of the Spectacle, section 62. In 1958, Debord announced that, quote, it is a matter of producing ourselves and not things that enslave us, end quote. Later, Debord condemned the history produced by bourgeois society is merely, quote, the history of the abstract movement of things, end quote, society of the spectacle. It must, of course, be stressed that Debord is referring to the commodity, not to the thing as such, and that he explicitly describes, quote, coagulation, end quote, as a consequence, not a cause of the spectacle. The question is not just a terminological question, however, and Debord does indeed seem to concur in Lukács's desire to reduce everything to process. Debord thus characterizes the proletariat as, quote, the class which is totally opposed to all reified externalizations, end quote, Society of the Spectacle, section 114. The most important point here is to make it as clear as can be that in a society ruled by value, things are in effect, quote, masters of social life, end quote, but only because the autonomous social relations that govern social life have become objectified in them. Debord insists, however, and in this respect he is close to Marx, as also to André Breton, that when it comes to another central tenet of vitalism and of history and class consciousness, a tenet embraced too by Max Horkheimer and Adorno in their Dialectic of Enlightenment and by Herbert Marcuse, this charge that science, technology, and their quantitative methods are intrinsically reifying forces. We saw earlier that the Situationist project, at least at the start, was to equip a technological society with the means to, quote, imagine what can be done with, end quote, its technology. When later on Debord turned his attention to the disasters produced by science, Debord did not lay the blame at the feet of science per se, but instead evoking, quote, the opposition to slavery that formed a significant part of its own history, end quote. Debord announced the subordination of science to a, quote, spectacular domination, end quote, that had, quote, cut down the vast tree of scientific knowledge merely in order to make itself a truncheon, end quote. The situationist dichotomy between life and non-life echoes a strong and simple opposition between, quote, true and, quote, false. Quote, true social life is said to be, quote, falsified by the spectacle. Quote, truth is conceived of by Debord in a static mode. It is no coincidence that he speaks on several occasions of something finally, quote, discovered, end quote, or, quote, revealed, end quote, in this connection. The words mensonge, lie, falsehood, and mensonger, deceitful, occur very frequently in the Society of the Spectacle, with the stress laid on, quote, communication, end quote, likewise implies the notion of a truth veiled in falsehood, but simply awaiting the moment when the veil will be torn aside and light shed. A truth so pictured ought logically to belong to that subject inalienable in its essence, which we spoke of above. The spectacle is described as, quote, representing all directly lived truth beneath the real presence of falsehood, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 219. And the task of the revolutionary proletariat is, quote, is the, quote, historic mission to establish truth in the world, end quote. And the task of the revolutionary proletariat is the, quote, historic mission to establish truth in the world, end quote, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 221. I'm not sure who that quote within the quote is from. Could be Lukács, could be Marx. So inimical, I'm gonna place my bet on Lukács, though. So inimical is the spectacle to truth that Debord likens it to a reign of madness, citing the comparison drawn by the psychiatrist Joseph Goebbels between ideology and mental illness. Society of the Spectacle, sections 217 to 219. Similarly, the spectacle contradicts the very simplest of verities. Quote, saying that 2 and 2 makes 4 is on the point of becoming a revolutionary act, end quote. In his comments on Society of the Spectacle, Debord alludes frequently to the, quote, completely illogical, end quote, character of the spectacle. The notion of, quote, secrecy, end quote, which is pivotal to this book, itself implies a truth existing beyond the reach of any manipulation, a concept of which the Hegel of the preface to the Phenomenology of Mind would doubtless have been somewhat skeptical. One sometimes gets the impression when reading Debord that he conceives of truth as a, quote, reflection, end quote, after the fashion of Leninism and positivism, but when Debord observes that all logic disappears with the disappearance of dialogue, which is its social basis, Debord seems to return to a more mediated view. Nor does Debord ever make it clear whether the spectacle is merely a false representation of reality, or whether the spectacle is in fact a falsification of reality itself. It is nevertheless possible to discern in his writings growing preference for the second alternative. According to the comments, the spectacle now has the means to falsify production as well as perception, just so long as one does not take it to mean the, quote, manipulation, end quote, of a reality once and for all. However, the concept of falsification as used by Debord is a very serviceable one. On the other hand, the notion that reality can be falsified creates conceptual problems. By reference to what, or to what, quote, authentic, end quote, other reality could it be falsified? Here Debord's theory appears suddenly to embody what might be called a, quote, platonic, end quote, inheritance. Phenomena with a concrete existence are apparently comparable with their models. Bread and wine, for instance, products with whose adulteration Debord was much concerned, are judged by comparison with, quote, real bread or, quote, genuine wine. The term of comparison is not, of course, some, quote, archetype, end quote, of wine floating in a platonic heaven of ideas, but wine as wine existed before the industrialization of agriculture. This clearly does not constitute any philosophical gauge of, quote, authenticity, end quote, but it unquestionably constitutes a palpable reality. A palpable reality. Debord likewise gets great store by exactitude in the definition of words, making language and language's older forms responsible for preserving the truth, and following the footsteps of George Orwell, Debord lambasts the newspeak that the spectacle has created for its own purposes. The only possible solution here, one supplied in fact by Debord himself, is to be clear that the, quote, authentic, end quote, is not being proposed as an absolute or as a static essence. On the contrary, the subject and the subject's needs undergo a slow development. Human history is the history of the subject's self-production through an interaction between, quote, the self, end quote, and the subject's creations, which are always a reflection of that, quote, self, end quote. A detached economy, and more generally every social agency, institution, and activity, by separating themselves off to the point where they emerge as autonomous powers, have had the effect of arresting this, quote, organic development of social needs, end quote, and unleashing a, quote, limitless artificiality, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 68. Whereas it is impossible to decide what in, quote, ontologically, end quote, true or authentic society might be, it is perfectly feasible to assess the, quote, ontological, end quote, falsity or inauthenticity of the society of the commodity. Value, as Marx shows in the opening pages of Capital, forcibly imposed equivalents upon things that are not equivalent. All the contradictions of the commodity, even the commodity's eventual crisis, are already contained in the, quote, simple commodity form, end quote, namely, quote, 20 yards of linen equal to one coat, end quote. Footnote, quote, the simple isolated or accidental form of value, 20 yards of linen equals one coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth one coat, ... The whole mystery of the form of value lies hidden in this simple form. Our real difficulty, therefore, is to analyze it, end quote, and footnote. But here we may go even further than Marx, and since the quantity has no significance, reduce the equation to, quote, linen equals coat, end quote. Linen is thus the same thing as coat or tea or iron. In other words, quote, white equals black, end quote. Obviously, a society founded on such a principle is bound to come to a bad end. Footnote, when the, quote, self-form, end quote, of bourgeois society is characterized in this way, it becomes abundantly clear that the Hegelian negation of the principle of non-contradictoriness with its celebrated opening equation, quote, being equals nothingness, end quote, corresponds exactly to the reality of the world of commodities, end footnote. It is thus quite possible to criticize capitalism, and especially the needs that are imposed on us, without immediately having to define what is, quote, natural or, quote, just. At the same time, this objective demonstration of the falsity of capitalism gives the lie to postmodernist relativism, for which every social form is equally arbitrary, and therefore in the last reckoning so also equally justified. It is, after all, so desirable that everything in the world be a mirror of the subject? There are many authors whose critiques of alienation bring them to the point of wanting a world in which nothing at all remains alien to the subject. This is a position, however, which cannot be reconciled with the dialectical view that subject and object are not an ultimate duality and do not refer either to an ultimate reality, rather they constitute one another in a reciprocal manner. Here we might recall Adorno's critique, according to which a fetishized concept of, quote, totality, end quote, tends to institute a tyranny of the subject everywhere. Footnote, negative dialectics, end footnote. Adorno draws a distinction between the concept of reification, which Adorno sees as justly critical of the fetishism of the commodity and of the unhealthy subordination of human beings to things, and the concept of, quote, alienation, end quote, which he associates the mentality of someone who, quote, looks upon thingness as radical evil, bracket, who, end bracket, would like to dynamize all entity into pure actuality, bracket, and who, end bracket, tends to be hostile to otherness, end quote. Just such an absolute dynamism, however, quote, would be that absolute action whose violent satisfaction lies in itself, the action in which non-identity is abused as a mere occasion, end quote. For those over-preoccupied with reification, quote, inspired by the wishful image of unbroken subjective immediacy, end quote, Adorno recalls that, quote, the total liquidation of everything think-like regressed to the subjectivism of the pure act. It hypostatized the indirect as direct. Pure immediacy and fetishism are equally untrue, end quote. Adorno. And Adorno, quote, and Adorno reminds, quote, existentialists, end quote, that objectivity here, the objectivity of metaphysical categories and the non-identical, while they may indeed be the expression of a, quote, sclerosed, end quote, as in sclerosis, society, can also indicate the real existence of the object world, failing whose acceptance and pacification, the subject can never be anything but a variant. The whole of Debord's theory, especially in its condemnation of, quote, contemplation and, quote, non-participation, is characterized by a vigorous activism that sees any occasion when the subject is not shaping his world as an abdication. In the power of workers' councils, he writes, quote, the proletarian movement becomes the proletarian movement's own product. This product is the producer himself, and in his own eyes the producer has himself as his goal, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 117. Likewise, the power of council is, quote, aspires to be recognized and to recognize itself, and to recognize the power of the council's self in a world of the power of council's own design, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 179. What is involved here, without any doubt, is the unity of subject and object. Obviously, however, Debord does not apprehend this unity in the form of a total identity, but rather in that of a world where objectifications standing absolutely opposed to the individual have been obviated. The very notion of the dérive, as also, in a more general way, that of adventure, presupposes a world that is unknown and, quote, other, end quote, relative to the subject. And situationist international text of 1970 quotes Hegel's Science of Logic to the effect that, quote, contradiction is the source of all movement, all life, end quote, where identity is a dead thing. Footnote. The text in question is Communiqué of the Situationist International concerning Vanagem, end quote, which severely criticized Raoul Vanagem just after his resignation from the group. In Vanagem's Revolution of Everyday Life, it is indeed possible to discern the desire for a total correspondence between self and world, and at times this wish does not seem to be far from mysticism, a tendency that made its appearance on various occasions in the ranks of the letterists and situationists, end footnote. The end of reification as it exists is not taken by Debord to entail a state of motionless repose without conflict or otherness. On the contrary, liberated humanity will, quote, at last be able to surrender liberated humanity's self joyously to the true divisions and never-ending confrontations of historical life, end quote. Footnote. Whereas others talked of, quote, the end of history, end quote, the situationists wanted at last to enter true history and to leave prehistory behind, end footnote. Nor is Debord opposed to the idea of losing oneself in the outside world, but Debord wants a world that gives one the desire to get lost in it. Once again, we are reminded of the marks of the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, quote, it is only when man's object becomes a human object, or objective man, that man does not lose himself in that object. This is only possible when it becomes a social object for him, and when he himself becomes a social being for himself. End quote. Marx. Unitary urbanism was conceived of as the construction of a genuinely human milieu where people would deliberately wander off the beaten path and go à la dérive. In many ways, the situationist theory partakes of an optimism that was peculiar to the 50s and 60s. When the letterists first began developing their ideas, the Second World War and Nazism were but a few years in the past. The thinking of many people is deeply marked by the horrors that had occurred and by the determination to make sure that such things would never happen again. By contrast, the letterists and later the situationists rarely alluded to these matters. The possibility of the world's falling back into barbarism preoccupied the situationists and the letterists far less than the possibility of the world's falling back into barbarism did others, and the situationists and the letterists were much more concerned about new technological means not being used in the service of freedom. In short, the letterists and situationists were more afraid of the preservation of the status quo than of historical regression. Footnote. Adorno, for instance, felt driven to accept modern society as a lesser evil, fearing that any attempt to change it might lead to something worse. End footnote. By the 1950s, the domination of nature had reached the point where its impact could easily be felt even on the plane of everyday life, though as yet no questions, whether the ecological or of any other kind, were raised about, quote, the price of progress, end quote. We know, of course, how sanguine that period was about the prospect of technology ushering in a reign of human happiness. Initially, the situationists hailed the automation of production as a harbinger of the liberation of society from thousands of years of bondage to toil. The whole situationist program of a, quote, civilization of play, end quote, was founded on this presumption. Debord several times cites Marx's observation that humanity never sets itself problems that it cannot solve. The prime task was the creation of a social order that would use its technical means in the interest of the society as a whole and not in the interest of single class and its desire to rule. Clearly, this view continued to endorse the classic schema of the development of the forces of production, leading to the overthrow of the relations of production. One is often struck when reading the early issues of the Internationale Situationniste by express certitude that society is evolving in the right direction, even if its superstructures are for the moment not falling into line. At this time, the situationists had a good deal of confidence in the world's ability to rid itself of the spectacle. On another plane, society seemed to have succeeded in controlling society's own mechanisms. The sustained growth rates, full employment, high wages, and lack of serious economic crises that were characteristic of the 50s and 60s were looked upon by many as durable achievements. Leftists especially felt that capitalism would never again do anything to interfere with this tendency, which, thanks to the famous, quote, integration of the proletariat, end quote, guaranteed the system's stability. Footnote. See, for example, the continuation of Cornelius Castoriadis, Les Mouvements révolutionnaires sur le capitalisme moderne in Socialisme ou Barbarie, numbers 32 and 34, April and December 1961, repeated in Castoriadis, Capitalisme moderne et révolution, Volume 2, English translation, Modern Capitalism and Modern Capitalism and Revolution in Political and Social Writings, edited and translated by David Ames Curtis, Volume 2. That's on this channel. What was I going to say? End footnote. The capitalist system of production was no longer perceived as inherently contradictory and bound in the long term to go into crisis. Rather, it was seen as the outcome of a pre-instituted will capable of directing the course of its development. The condemnation of the economy as a separate sphere, a cardinal point for Debord, is not, however, at odds with hopes placed in automation, which could help transform material production into a pure means intended to satisfy human desires rather than enlist them in the development of an autonomous economy. The 1970s were to demonstrate that, quote, affluence, end quote, was revocable. So long as essential needs seem to have been definitely addressed, the question whether something better might not exist rises much more readily. Or to put it in situationist terms, when survival is guaranteed, life becomes a demand. When survival is guaranteed, life becomes a demand. It was thus perfectly functional from the capitalist point of view when in the 70s the traditional crisis returned, complete with anxiety about employment and falling real wages. When you are surrounded by millions of unemployed workers, or in other words, by unlimited potential scab labor, the assembly line once more comes to resemble a lifeline. This was a period, too, when a rising awareness of the threat of ecological catastrophe and a revival of the, quote, Cold War, end quote, were also putting the problem of mere survival back on the front burner. Like any viable concept, the notion of the spectacle is in some degree bound to its time. That of the, quote, cybernetic, end quote, welfare state in the high tide of Fordism, when capitalism claimed to have resolved capitalism's traditional contradictions, including capitalism's need to bar the majority of the population from the enjoyment of abundance. Footnote, for a criticism of the concept of, quote, the spectacle, end quote, see David Jacobs and Christopher Winks, At Dusk, the Situationist Movement in Historical Perspective, published in 1975. End footnote. It must nevertheless be acknowledged that, even at the time, the critique developed by Debord and the Situationists, for all that it was the most advanced, succeeded no better than its rivals in identifying possible remedies. It is certainly not enough to point, as many do, to alienation and alienation's discontents as a sufficient motor for a new revolutionary movement. The years after 1968 showed just how impossible it is to change society through individual action with no program and no organization by virtue of a slow infiltration of new mores or changes in the cultural climate, for each such innovation gets incorporated into an essentially unchanging whole. Debord had sought to designate a force having a real prospect of intervening, but the hopes Debord placed in the proletariat turned out in the long run to be illusory. In addition, the situationists overestimated the power of theory. When history is seen as a prise de conscience, of course, the role assigned to theory will inevitably be a very significant role. And in Debord's view, the agitation of 1968 and its aftermath arose essentially from the spread of situationist theory. Quote, "So great is the power of words uttered at their moment," end quote. I want to repeat that. In Debord's view, the agitation of 1968 and its aftermath arose essentially from the spread of situationist theory. Quote, "So great is the power of words uttered at their moment," end quote. Footnote. Quote, "So great," end quote, indeed, that Debord was convinced that if his friend Gianfranco Sanguinetti had only gone public, the moment of Aldo Moro's kidnapping in 1978, with his conviction that this act was orchestrated by the Italian secret police, it might well have caused the whole charade to collapse. Sanguinetti subsequently published Del terrorismo e dello Stato, la teoria e la pratica del terrorismo per la prima volta divulgate, of which a French translation with a new preface by the author, Du terrorisme et de l'État, has been translated into English by Lucy Forsyth and Michel Pugin as On Terrorism and the State. See also Edition Champ Libre, Correspondence Volume 2. Okay. Where am I? End footnote. The difficulty of gauging the real possibilities of the situationist critique and the situationist critique's practical application was exacerbated too by the lack of any answer to the question whether the critique of the spectacle is itself part of the spectacle or just how it might be possible to position oneself outside the spectacle. At the beginning of the 1970s, following the, quote, success, end quote, of the situationists, the objection was frequently raised that the dissemination of Debord's ideas, written work, and films meant that Debord was himself participating in the spectacle. Debord, for his part, put these objections down to an envy fueled by the fact that it had now become impossible to ignore Debord's theories. It is hard, all the same, to explain how the world could be said, on the one hand, to be full, around 1970 at any rate, of resistance to the spectacle, while at the same time virtually nothing seemed to escape the situationist verdict of, quote, spectacular opposition, end quote. The paradox may be explained in part by the extreme flexibility of the concept of, quote, spectacle, end quote, which Debord at times takes in the restrictive sense of the culture industry, the mass media, and the reign of images. It is this sense that the situationists have in mind when they evoke, quote, the indifference that is displayed by proletarians qua class in face of all forms of the culture of the spectacle, end quote. The spectacle so conceived is, quote, further removed than ever from social reality, end quote. In a more figurative sense, however, the notion of the spectacle refers, first of all, to Western capitalism, then by extension to all existing society, and finally even covers societies of the past, inasmuch as, quote, power as a separate realm has always had a spectacular aspect, end quote. I want to repeat that. In a more figurative sense, however, the notion of the spectacle refers first of all to Western capitalism, then by extension to all existing society, and finally even covers societies of the past, inasmuch as, quote, power as a separate realm has always had a spectacular aspect, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 25. Footnote. Note that Debord is in danger here of slipping into a, quote, dehistoricized, end quote, view of alienation, something that tends to happen when, like Lukács in History and Class Consciousness, one lays too much emphasis on the reifying effect of the division of labor, which of course considerably antedated the advent of capitalism. I don't think that's this is just a comment for myself, end footnote. This is just a comment for myself. I don't think that's dehistoricizing alienation at all. It would be wrong to say that alienation takes on the same form in any class exploitative society that ever existed. because alienation certainly doesn't take the same form in every exploitative society that ever existed. But that doesn't mean that alienation there is not present, right? I think that alienation takes a particular form in a society dominated by commodity production, but I don't think that alienation as such is something that is particularly specific to capitalism. And that's why I think for me, like, you don't have to demonstrate whether or not the Soviet Union or other societies like the Soviet Union were capitalist or not to derive whether or not alienation in fact existed there at politically or economically, with both of those both politically and economically being put in quotes. Dehistoricizing would be like saying that alienation is a transhistorical fact of social life, which is certainly not the case. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Take it for what you will. Furthermore, although the situation is acknowledged that the society's rulers were not a monolithic group, Debord never went very deeply into the spectacle's internal articulations and contradictions, those contradictions which would once have been described as, quote, secondary, end quote. The Leninist strategy of exploiting antagonisms within the opposing camp in order to weaken it unquestionably gave rise to the dubious practice of forming tactical alliances. The fact remains, however, that the situationist idea of a frontal assault by the weakest of the forces in play is at odds with every known rule of strategy and almost certainly destroys any conceivable prospect of victory. There are some who feel that in the comments on the Society of the Spectacle, a dark pessimism replaces Debord's earlier optimism, a pessimism according to which all opposition to the spectacle is now seen as set up by the spectacle itself, when not a single trace of revolutionary force remains in the world. A careful reading, however, suggests that Debord does not at all mean to announce the spectacle's final victory. Footnote. This is explicitly stated in, quote, cette mauvaise réputation. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but you get what I'm saying. Debord speaks a great deal of secret police activity, for example, but nowhere does Debord intimate that such covert agencies are about to take over the world. On the contrary, Debord notes that the Society of the Spectacle has lost any ability to manage itself in a strategic manner and can only stand and defend its own, quote, fragile perfection, end quote. In other words, once the commodity form, thanks to the, quote, integrated spectacle, end quote, has completed its investment of society, the very possibility of managing the mad laws of the economy is reduced to the vain gesticulations of legions and conspirators. Debord's oft contested claim that there is no more opposition because everyone is now part of the system actually refers to the fact that imminent opposition to the system, such as the traditional workers' movement and the, quote, liberation movements, end quote, of the Third World, have now definitively run their course. Only in fancy could the traditional workers' movement and the, quote, liberation movements, end quote, ever have been assigned a transcendent role. For in reality, what these oppositions challenged were the imperfect phases of capitalism, which large sectors of the population were excluded from the access channels of capitalist socialization. When the commodity system as such goes into crisis, however, the role of such imminent oppositions is at an end. The trouble with Debord's account is that his picture of such a crisis is formed on the inadequate basis of a critique of, quote, manipulation, end quote, which for Debord seems to mean the end of all opposition rather than the beginning of a new real opposition. Debord has not the slightest doubt about the reality of the crisis of capitalism. However, he identifies the cause thereof less in the dissatisfaction that the system creates than in the system's own dynamics. In his book, quote, cette mauvaise réputation, end quote, Debord speaks of the, quote, obvious dissolution of the entire system, end quote, and asserts that, quote, nothing works anymore and nothing is believed anymore, end quote. We are indeed witness to a crisis of the value form itself, not merely of the value form's secondary characteristics. The ecological emergency is but one feature of this more elemental crisis. Others are the impossibility in this era of globalization for, quote, politics, end quote, or for national states to continue operating as regulatory agencies, and the crisis of the subject is constituted by value, especially visible in the crisis of the relationship between the sexes. The most tangible effects, however, are those produced by the eclipse of labor as the foundation of society. Only a small portion of the labor formerly needed is now required to keep production going. all the same, to operate under sufficiently profitable conditions, very large investments of fixed capital are essential, and this is feasible only in the most advanced countries and in high technology sectors. And since the de facto globalization, not just of trade, but also of production, obliges the entire world to align itself on the productivity levels of the most highly developed centers, a large part of the planet is bound to lose on this playing field. Note that this kind of missing out on failing in competition is not the same as imperialism. That's very important to say, in my opinion. Or some people call it neo-imperialism or something like that. But that's like calling wage slavery or wage labor neo-slavery. Obviously, there's commonalities, but these are radically different conditions, right? Like, you can say that wage labor is similar to slavery in certain respects, because it absolutely is. And you can say the same thing about countries whose national economies lose out on the competitive world market. Has something similar to the era of imperialism. But I think it's very much a mistake to try to collapse, those dynamics into the same thing for social scientific reasons as well as for political reasons. Critiquing one portion of the interstate system is like critiquing monopolies and not the capitalist system as a whole. The problem is not particular states, it's not the United States, or the lack of multipolarity or something like that, but the fact of polarities as such, the fact of that system, the polarity of the system of nation states as such, that is the problem. There's a certain sense, despite all its chest bumping, that the critique of imperialism is infinitely less radical than a critique of the international state system as such. Back to the text. And since the de facto globalization, not just of trade, but also of production, obliges the entire world to align itself on the productivity level of the most highly developed centers, a very large part of the planet is bound to lose on this playing field. The productive plant of disadvantaged countries, even though it may be capable of producing consumer goods, will no longer be able to employ living labor in such a way as to produce exchange value in the world market, and will consequently be dismantled. Such countries and sectors are thus excluded from the worldwide conduits of value, will nevertheless continue to exert an ominous pressure on the very few winners, generating endless wars, mafias, and murky trafficking in whatever marketable materials are still in their possession. Debord was one of few people to have understood that the collapse of the Eastern Bloc countries did not signify the triumph of the Western social model, but on the contrary heralded another stage in the global breakdown of commodity-driven society. Regimes with planned economies have been merely a variant of the society designed for backward countries, regimes with planned economies have been merely a variant of that society designed for backward countries, and the raison d'etre disappeared once basic industries had been set up. Footnote. The best account of this process is Robert Kurt's Der Kollaps der Modernisierung of 1991. End footnote. But Debord was less on target when he wrote in 1992 in his preface to the third edition of The Society of the Spectacle that the main problem for capitalism was, and would continue to be, quote, how can the poor be made to work, end quote. As a matter of fact, the main problem of capitalism today is to decide what to do with the vast majority of humanity, for whom, qua living labor, it has no use in view of the degree to which production has been successfully automated. Footnote. This change of period is no better grasped by those who persist in using categories such as, quote, imperialism, end quote, when it's perfectly plain that capital has no interest in going out to conquer spaces from which there is nothing more to be extracted and which would only become dead weight. The countries of the East and South have lately fallen to their knees begging to be exploited in exchange for mere survival. But the so-called imperialist centers have as little inclination to oblige them as they have to intervene in the world's trouble spots. End footnote. That's the end of this section, which again is titled, let me see what it is titled, The Aporias of the Subject and the Prospects for action. The next section is titled Two Sources and Two Aspects of Debord's Theory. I thank you for listening. Have a good one.